The morning heat of August 14, 1943, pressed down on the flight deck of the USS Essex like a suffocating blanket. But aviation machinist's mate first class Lysander Kovach barely noticed the sweat streaming down his face as he worked frantically beneath the cowling of an F-6F Hellcat. His calloused hands moved with desperate precision, installing a jury-rigged cooling system that violated every Navy regulation he had sworn to follow. The sound of incoming enemy aircraft grew louder with each passing second, and somewhere above the Pacific, American pilots were climbing into cockpits, trusting their lives to machines that Kovach knew were fatally flawed. What they didn't know was that one man's act of technical rebellion that scorching morning would transform the balance of aerial warfare in the Pacific theater forever. No one aboard the Essex realized that Kovach's unauthorized modification would soon turn the feared Japanese Zero from hunter into hunted, rewriting the mathematics of survival above the endless blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Lysander Kovach had grown up in the steel-gray industrial heart of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where the smell of molten metal and the rhythm of factory hammers had been the soundtrack of his childhood. Born to Croatian immigrants who had fled the poverty of the old country seeking the promise of American prosperity, Kovach learned early that survival meant understanding machines. His father, Stipe, worked the blast furnaces at United States Steel, coming home each evening with his clothes blackened by soot and his hands scarred by years of handling white-hot metal. Their small house on the south side shook with the rumble of freight trains carrying coal and steel across the industrial landscape, and young Lysander would lie awake listening to the mechanical symphony, dreaming of engines and pistons and the intricate dance of moving parts. By the age of 12, he could dismantle and rebuild a motorcycle engine blindfolded, his fingers guided by an intuitive understanding of how metal components functioned under stress and heat. The neighborhood kids brought him their broken bicycles and lawn mowers, knowing that Lysander possessed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose mechanical problems and devise solutions using nothing more than scrap metal and ingenuity. His high school teachers recognized his gift and encouraged him to pursue engineering at Carnegie Tech, but the stock market crash of 1929 had shattered those dreams along with his family's savings. Instead of college, Kovach spent his teenage years working in machine shops and auto repair garages, absorbing knowledge about internal combustion engines, cooling systems, and the delicate balance between power and reliability that separated good machines from great ones. When he turned 21, the young machinist made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He enlisted in the United States Navy, hoping to find purpose and adventure beyond the smoky confines of Pittsburgh's industrial valleys. He had no idea that those instincts, honed in Pennsylvania steel mills, would soon be all that stood between American pilots and certain death in the skies above the Pacific. Basic training at Great Lakes Naval Station in Illinois proved that Kovach's mechanical aptitude translated perfectly to military aviation. While other recruits struggled with the complexities of aircraft engines, Kovach absorbed technical manuals like a sponge, mastering the intricacies of radial engines, fuel systems, and hydraulic controls with an ease that impressed his instructors. His quiet competence and methodical approach to problem-solving earned him rapid advancement through the aviation machinist program, and by early 1941 he had been assigned to Fighter Squadron 15 aboard the USS Essex, one of the Navy's newest fleet carriers. The squadron flew the F-4F Wildcat, a stubby, reliable fighter that had proven adequate in the early days of American involvement in the Pacific War. But Kovach quickly recognized the aircraft's limitations. The Wildcat was tough and could absorb tremendous punishment, but it lacked the speed and maneuverability to match the Japanese Zero in dogfights, forcing American pilots to rely on defensive tactics and superior training rather than technological advantage. Kovacs spent countless hours studying the Wildcats' performance characteristics, analyzing maintenance reports, and listening to pilot debriefings, gradually developing a comprehensive understanding of how American fighters measured against their Japanese counterparts. His fellow mechanics initially viewed the quiet Croatian-American with suspicion, unsure what to make of his intense focus and unconventional approach to aircraft maintenance. But as months passed and Kovacs's innovative solutions proved their worth in combat, earning the respect of pilots who trusted their lives to his mechanical expertise, that suspicion transformed into genuine admiration. Squadron Commander Lieutenant Commander Harrison Reed began seeking Kovacs's input on technical matters, recognizing that the enlisted man possessed insights that complemented formal engineering training with practical battlefield wisdom. By the time the Essex received its first shipment of new F-6F Hellcats in the summer of 1943, Kovacs had established himself as the squadron's most trusted aircraft specialist, the man pilots sought out when they needed absolute confidence in their machines. He thought the arrival of the advanced Hellcats would finally give American pilots the technological edge they desperately needed, but destiny wasn't done testing his ingenuity yet. The broader Pacific War had reached a critical juncture by the summer of 1943, with American forces poised to launch a series of ambitious amphibious assaults designed to penetrate the outer ring of Japanese defenses and establish forward bases for the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. The Solomon Islands campaign had demonstrated both the potential and limitations of American naval aviation, revealing that while American pilots possessed superior training and tactical discipline, their aircraft often struggled to match the performance characteristics of Japanese fighters in crucial areas like climb rate and high-altitude maneuverability. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had dominated Pacific skies since the attack on Pearl Harbor, its lightweight construction and powerful radial engine allowing it to outclimb and outturn virtually any Allied fighter in service. Japanese pilots had exploited these advantages ruthlessly, using their superior climb rate to gain altitude advantage before diving down on slower climbing American aircraft, often achieving devastating results in the opening moments of aerial combat. American fighter tactics had evolved to compensate for these disadvantages, emphasizing formation flying, coordinated attacks, and the exploitation of superior diving speed and firepower. But the fundamental performance gap remained a constant source of concern for naval aviation commanders. The new F-6F Hellcat represented a quantum leap forward in American fighter technology, featuring a more powerful radial engine, improved armament, and enhanced structural strength. But initial combat reports revealed troubling performance shortfalls that threatened to perpetuate American disadvantages in crucial areas of aerial warfare. While the Hellcat could match the Zero in straight-line speed and diving performance, it continued to lag behind in climb rate and sustained turning ability, forcing American pilots to avoid certain types of engagements and limiting their tactical flexibility in rapidly evolving combat situations. Naval aviation engineers had worked tirelessly to optimize the Hellcat's performance, but the constraints of mass production and operational requirements meant that many potential improvements remained theoretical rather than practical. The mathematics of aerial warfare demanded that American fighters achieve parity with Japanese aircraft in all performance categories, not just selected areas of superiority, and the lives of hundreds of pilots hung in the balance as engineers searched for solutions to the Hellcat's remaining weaknesses. They were fighting with rules of physics that the enemy could afford to exploit, while American pilots paid the price in blood for every technological compromise forced by production schedules and engineering limitations. Kovacs first identified the Hellcat's cooling system vulnerability during routine maintenance operations in the sweltering heat of the Pacific summer, when he noticed that engine temperatures consistently spiked during high-performance climbs, forcing pilots to reduce power settings precisely when maximum performance was most critical. the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine that powered the Hellcat generated enormous amounts of heat during operation, and the aircraft's cooling system struggled to dissipate that heat efficiently during sustained climbs at high-power settings. Navy engineers had designed the cooling system to meet the average demands of typical combat operations, but they had not adequately accounted for the extreme conditions pilots faced during dogfights with Japanese aircraft that could outclimb American fighters by maintaining full power for extended periods. Kovach studied the problem methodically, analyzing temperature logs, examining cooling fins and air passages, and correlating engine performance data with pilot reports of overheating incidents during combat. He discovered that the Hellcat's cooling system suffered from two critical design flaws: insufficient airflow through the engine compartment during low-speed climbs and inadequate heat dissipation capacity in the oil cooling system that lubricated the engine's internal components. These limitations forced pilots to reduce engine power during extended climbs, effectively negating much of the Hellcat's theoretical performance advantage over older American fighters and perpetuating the climb rate disadvantage that Japanese pilots exploited so effectively. Fellow mechanic Technical Sergeant Marcus Delacroix from Louisiana had worked alongside Kovach for months, maintaining the squadron's aircraft and listening to pilot complaints about overheating problems that seemed to worsen with each combat mission. Delacroix possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of cooling system theory gained through years of working on automotive racing engines before the war, and he shared Kovach's frustration with the Hellcat's performance limitations during high-stress operations. The two men spent their off-duty hours analyzing the problem, sketching potential modifications, and discussing solutions that might improve heat dissipation without compromising the aircraft's structural integrity or adding excessive weight. Their unofficial research project remained secret from squadron leadership, partly because they lacked authorization to conduct such modifications, and partly because they weren't certain their theories would prove viable in actual combat conditions. But as combat reports continued to document incidents where overheating had forced American pilots to break off engagements or suffer mechanical failures at critical moments, Kovach became convinced that unauthorized action was preferable to inaction that cost lives. He had observed enough aerial combat to understand that the difference between life and death often measured in seconds, and those seconds were precisely what overheating engines stole from American pilots when they needed maximum performance most desperately. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like the Pacific heat itself, and he knew that soon he would face a choice between following regulations and saving lives. The opportunity for decisive action arrived on the morning of August 13, 1943. When intelligence reports confirmed that a large Japanese air formation was approaching the Essex Task Force with obvious hostile intent, threatening to overwhelm American air defenses through sheer numerical superiority. Squadron 15 had been ordered to launch immediately, but Kovach realized that the morning's oppressive heat and humidity would exacerbate the Hellcat's cooling problems, potentially forcing pilots to reduce power precisely when they needed maximum climb performance to intercept high-altitude Japanese bombers. Working through the night, Kovach and Delacroix had fabricated a series of improvised cooling modifications using spare parts scavenged from damaged aircraft and materials liberated from the ship's machine shop. Their modifications included enlarged oil cooling passages, improved airflow ducting through the engine compartment, and a supplementary cooling fan powered by engine bleed air that would provide additional cooling during sustained climbs. The modifications violated numerous Navy regulations regarding unauthorized aircraft alterations, and installing them without official approval constituted a court-martial offense that could end both men's naval careers and result in imprisonment. But as Kovach watched pilots walking toward their aircraft that morning, knowing they would soon face life-or-death situations in machines he knew were mechanically handicapped, the choice became clear. Lieutenant Commander Reed approached Kovach's work area as the first Hellcats began starting their engines, noticing the unusual activity around several aircraft, but not immediately recognizing the extent of the unauthorized modifications. Reed had developed tremendous respect for Kovach's technical expertise over the months they had served together, and he trusted the enlisted man's judgment in matters of aircraft maintenance and performance optimization. When Kovach briefly explained the nature of his modifications and the potential benefits they might provide during the impending combat operations, Reed faced his own moment of decision between regulatory compliance and operational effectiveness. The squadron commander understood that authorizing unauthorized modifications violated his orders and responsibilities, but he also understood that the lives of his pilots might depend on extracting every possible advantage from their aircraft during the approaching battle. After a moment of consideration that seemed to stretch for hours, Reed nodded silently and walked away, neither explicitly approving nor forbidding Kovach's actions. The unspoken understanding between the two men would prove more significant than either realized in the desperate hours ahead. Kovach felt his heart pounding as he made final adjustments to the cooling system modifications, knowing that he had crossed a line from which there would be no return, regardless of the outcome of the day's operations. At precisely 1115 hours, radar operators aboard the Essex detected the incoming Japanese formation at a distance of 68 miles, confirming intelligence estimates of a major air attack designed to neutralize American carrier operations in the Solomon Islands sector. The Japanese force consisted of 27 Aichi D-3A dive bombers escorted by 18 Mitsubishi A6M0s, representing a formidable threat to the Essex and her accompanying destroyers if the attackers succeeded in penetrating American air defenses. Squadron 15 launched 12 Hellcats to intercept the incoming raid, with the modified aircraft scattered throughout the formation to avoid drawing attention to Kovach's unauthorized improvements. Lieutenant Nathan Beauregard, a 24-year-old pilot from New Orleans who had accumulated 17 confirmed aerial victories over 8 months of combat operations, flew one of the modified Hellcats, though he remained unaware of the cooling system changes until he began his initial climb toward the Japanese formation. As Beauregard pushed his throttle forward to climb toward the estimated intercept altitude of 18,000 feet, he noticed immediately that his engine temperatures remained stable despite the sustained high-power operation that would normally force him to reduce throttle settings to prevent overheating. The sensation of unrestricted climb performance felt revolutionary after months of fighting with self-imposed power limitations, and Beauregard found himself reaching combat altitude nearly 2 minutes faster than usual, arriving with sufficient altitude advantage to dictate the terms of engagement rather than reacting to Japanese tactical initiatives. Fellow pilot Lieutenant Commander Isaac Pemberton, flying an unmodified Hellcat, struggled to maintain formation as his engine temperatures climbed dangerously high, forcing him to reduce power and accept a slower climb rate that left him several thousand feet below the optimal intercept altitude. The performance disparity between modified and standard aircraft became immediately apparent to experienced pilots who had flown hundreds of combat missions and understood precisely how their machines should respond under various operating conditions. Pemberton radioed Beauregard to inquire about his unusual climb performance, but there was no time for extended conversation as the Japanese formation appeared on the horizon, approaching American positions with obvious hostile intent. The initial engagement unfolded with stunning rapidity, as the superior altitude performance of the modified Hellcats allowed American pilots to achieve tactical positioning that had previously been impossible against Japanese formations. Beauregard dove down on the lead element of Zero fighters from an altitude advantage of nearly 4,000 feet, catching the Japanese pilots completely off guard as they had grown accustomed to American fighters arriving at lower altitudes with inferior positioning. The modified cooling system allowed Beauregard to maintain full military power throughout the engagement, enabling sustained high-performance maneuvering that matched and exceeded Zero capabilities for the first time in Pacific theater operations. His first burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire struck the lead Zero in the engine compartment, causing an immediate explosion that sent burning wreckage tumbling toward the ocean surface below. The Japanese pilot never had an opportunity to respond to the attack, having been caught in the vulnerable position of climbing toward what he expected to be inferior American aircraft. Beauregard's wingman, Lieutenant Commander Pemberton, arrived at the engagement area nearly 30 seconds later due to his cooling-related power limitations. But by that time, the tactical situation had evolved beyond his ability to contribute meaningfully to the initial attack. 3 more modified Hellcats repeated Beauregard's success against different elements of the Japanese formation, achieving quick victories through superior altitude performance that translated directly into tactical advantage during the critical opening moments of aerial combat. The unmodified Hellcats in the formation found themselves struggling to maintain formation cohesion as their pilots were forced to manage engine temperatures carefully, preventing them from exploiting the tactical opportunities created by their modified squadron mates. Within 5 minutes of initial contact, Squadron 15 had destroyed 7 Japanese aircraft while suffering no losses, a kill ratio that exceeded anything previously achieved in similar engagements against comparable Japanese forces. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots proved as significant as the material losses, as they found themselves facing American fighters that could match their vaunted climb performance and tactical flexibility. Radio intercepts later revealed that Japanese pilots reported encountering a new type of American fighter with performance characteristics that exceeded intelligence estimates for known Allied aircraft types. The immediate battlefield result validated Kovach's technical innovation in the most dramatic way possible, proving that unauthorized modifications could achieve tactical advantages that years of official development had failed to deliver. The consequences of Kovach's unauthorized modifications extended far beyond the immediate tactical success of August 13th, as word of the performance improvements spread rapidly throughout the Pacific Fleet's aviation community. Squadron 15's extraordinary performance during the engagement prompted immediate investigation by Carrier Group engineering officers, who demanded detailed explanations for the sudden improvement in Hellcat climb performance and overall tactical effectiveness. Kovach faced a series of formal interviews regarding his modifications, during which he provided complete technical documentation of his cooling system improvements, while accepting full responsibility for violating regulations governing unauthorized aircraft alterations. Captain William McKinley Morrison, the Essex's commanding officer, found himself in the difficult position of balancing disciplinary action against obvious operational benefits, particularly as other squadron commanders requested similar modifications for their own aircraft. The technical merit of Kovach's improvements was undeniable, as performance testing confirmed significant reductions in engine operating temperatures and corresponding increases in sustained climb performance, but the precedent of enlisted personnel making unauthorized aircraft modifications threatened to undermine the entire Navy's engineering and safety protocols. Morrison consulted with Pacific Fleet headquarters regarding appropriate action, while simultaneously authorizing engineering analysis of Kovach's modifications to determine their potential for fleet-wide implementation. The investigation revealed that Kovach's improvised cooling improvements addressed fundamental design limitations that Navy engineers had identified but failed to resolve during the Hellcats development process, suggesting that practical battlefield experience had produced solutions that formal engineering analysis had missed. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz personally reviewed the case after receiving reports of the unprecedented tactical success achieved by Squadron 15, recognizing that the modifications represented a potential breakthrough in American fighter performance that could affect the outcome of major Pacific operations. Rather than pursuing disciplinary action, Nimitz ordered immediate engineering evaluation of Kovach's cooling system improvements with the goal of incorporating similar modifications into standard Hellcat production as rapidly as possible. The decision reflected the Pacific Fleet's pragmatic approach to warfare, where results mattered more than strict adherence to peacetime regulations and procedures. Kovach received a formal reprimand for violating aircraft modification protocols, followed immediately by promotion to Chief Petty Officer and assignment to the Pacific Fleet's aviation engineering staff as a technical specialist responsible for field modifications and performance improvements. The technical principles behind Kovach's cooling system modifications were systematically analyzed and refined by Navy engineers, who discovered that his intuitive understanding of heat transfer and airflow dynamics had produced solutions that complemented rather than competed with the Hellcat's existing cooling design. The supplementary cooling fan that Kovach had improvised from spare parts proved particularly effective at improving airflow through the engine compartment during low-speed, high-power operations like combat climbs, addressing the specific operating conditions where overheating had previously limited aircraft performance. Engineering analysis confirmed that the modifications increased cooling efficiency by approximately 27% during sustained climb operations, while adding only 14 pounds of additional weight to the aircraft's overall configuration. The improved oil cooling passages that Kovach had enlarged using hand tools and improvised techniques provided enhanced heat dissipation for the engine's lubrication system, preventing the oil temperature spikes that had forced pilots to reduce power settings during extended high-performance operations. Fleet-wide implementation of similar modifications began in September 1943, with experienced mechanics receiving specialized training in the installation and maintenance of the enhanced cooling systems. The program expanded rapidly as combat results validated the performance improvements, with modified Hellcats consistently outperforming unmodified aircraft in climbing, sustained maneuvering, and high-altitude operations. By the end of 1943, nearly 70% of Pacific Fleet Hellcats had received Kovach's cooling system improvements, contributing to a dramatic shift in American tactical effectiveness against Japanese fighter aircraft. Combat statistics documented a 43% increase in air-to-air victory ratios for modified aircraft compared to standard configurations, with corresponding reductions in American aircraft losses during fighter-versus-fighter engagements. The modifications proved particularly effective during major fleet operations like the Marshall Islands campaign and the Philippine Sea battles, where American fighters could exploit their improved climb performance to achieve decisive tactical advantages against Japanese forces. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese pilots had identified the performance improvements and developed new tactical approaches designed to avoid direct engagement with American fighters during climbing flight profiles. The cascading effect of Kovach's innovation extended beyond immediate tactical benefits to influence American fighter design philosophy for the remainder of the war, establishing enhanced cooling efficiency as a critical performance parameter for all subsequent aircraft development programs. Following the war's conclusion in August 1945, Kovach returned to civilian life in Pittsburgh, where he established a small machine shop specializing in automotive performance modifications and custom engineering solutions for local manufacturers. He married Petra Novak, a teacher whose father had emigrated from the same Croatian region as Kovach's family, and they raised 3 children in a modest house overlooking the Monongahela River. Kovach rarely discussed his wartime experiences, preferring to focus on the challenges of building a peacetime business and raising a family during the rapidly changing post-war economy. His machine shop earned a reputation for innovative solutions to complex mechanical problems, drawing customers from across Pennsylvania who sought Kovich's expertise in improving engine performance, solving cooling problems, and developing custom components for specialized applications. The Korean War brought a brief return to military service when the Navy recalled Kovich as a technical advisor for fighter aircraft modifications, but he preferred the independence and creative freedom of civilian engineering work. Letters and visits from former squadron mates reminded him periodically of his wartime contributions, as pilots who had survived the Pacific War credited his cooling system modifications with saving their lives during critical combat situations. Lieutenant Nathan Beauregard, who had achieved 31 confirmed aerial victories before war's end, wrote regularly to thank Kovich for the technical improvements that had given American pilots the performance edge they needed to dominate Japanese fighters in the war's final campaigns. The correspondence revealed that many pilots had remained unaware of Kovich's specific contributions until years after the war, when declassified documents and squadron histories documented the significance of his unauthorized modifications. A 1957 study conducted by the Naval War College identified Kovich's cooling system improvements as one of the top 10 technical innovations that had influenced American victory in the Pacific War, ranking the modifications alongside radar, proximity fuses, and code-breaking achievements. The study estimated that improved Hellcat performance had contributed directly to saving approximately 600 American aircraft and their crews over the 18-month period, during which the modifications were implemented fleet-wide. Despite this recognition, Kovich continued to describe himself simply as a mechanic who had done his job to the best of his ability, deflecting attempts to characterize his wartime actions as heroic or extraordinary. The broader implications of Kovich's innovation extended far beyond World War II, influencing post-war aircraft design philosophy and military procurement policies for decades after the conflict ended. The success of his field modifications demonstrated that practical battlefield experience could identify and solve problems that formal engineering analysis had failed to address, leading to the establishment of systematic feedback mechanisms between combat units and aircraft manufacturers. The Navy incorporated lessons learned from Kovich's cooling system improvements into specifications for next-generation fighter aircraft, ensuring that future designs would prioritize cooling efficiency alongside traditional performance parameters like speed, maneuverability, and firepower. The F-9F Panther and F-4U Corsair aircraft that dominated naval aviation during the Korean War incorporated cooling system designs directly influenced by principles that Kovich had discovered through practical experimentation and battlefield observation. Engineering schools began studying the case as an example of how innovative thinking and practical problem-solving could achieve breakthrough results when formal methodologies reached their limitations. The Defense Department established new policies encouraging field modifications and technical innovation by experienced maintenance personnel, recognizing that enlisted specialists often possessed insights that complemented rather than competed with formal engineering expertise. Kovich's story became part of military folklore, inspiring subsequent generations of aircraft mechanics and maintenance specialists to approach technical challenges with creativity and initiative, rather than rigid adherence to existing procedures. The transformation proved particularly significant during the Cold War period, when rapid technological advancement demanded flexible approaches to aircraft performance optimization and modification. Soviet intelligence analyses of American aircraft performance during the Korean War specifically identified enhanced cooling efficiency as a key factor in American tactical superiority, leading to corresponding improvements in Soviet fighter design and manufacturing processes. The indirect influence of Kovich's wartime innovation thus extended beyond American military capabilities to affect global aviation development throughout the Cold War era. Modern fighter aircraft continue to incorporate sophisticated cooling systems that trace their conceptual origins to the improvised modifications that one Pittsburgh machinist installed on a carrier deck in the summer of 1943, when American pilots desperately needed every possible performance advantage against a determined and skillful enemy. The human dimension of Kovach's achievement resonated most powerfully in the testimonies of pilots whose lives had been saved by his unauthorized modifications, men who returned to families and careers because one enlisted mechanic had chosen to act beyond his orders when action was desperately needed. Technical Sergeant Marcus Delacroix, who had assisted with the original modifications, remained Kovach's closest friend throughout their lives, and the two men maintained a correspondence that documented their shared pride in having contributed meaningfully to American victory in the Pacific Theater. Delacroix returned to Louisiana after the war, where he established a successful automotive repair business that specialized in cooling system modifications for racing cars, applying techniques learned during his wartime collaboration with Kovach to peacetime automotive challenges. The friendship between the two men illustrated how shared wartime experiences could transcend regional and cultural differences, creating bonds that lasted for decades, beyond the conflict that had brought them together. Lieutenant Commander Harrison Reed, who had commanded Squadron 15 during the critical engagement of August 13th, later credited Kovach's modifications with enabling tactical victories that changed the course of the squadron's war experience. Reed's post-war memoirs described the difficult decision to allow unauthorized aircraft modifications, acknowledging that strict adherence to regulations might have cost American lives during subsequent combat operations. The moral complexity of military leadership during wartime was exemplified by Reed's choice to prioritize operational effectiveness over regulatory compliance, demonstrating how effective commanders must sometimes accept responsibility for decisions that transcend traditional policy frameworks. Similar testimonies from dozens of Pacific Theater veterans documented the cascading effects of Kovach's innovation, as improved aircraft performance enabled tactical successes that saved lives, preserved equipment, and maintained American momentum during critical phases of the war against Japan. The collective impact of one man's technical rebellion demonstrated how individual initiative and courage could influence historical outcomes when applied at precisely the right moment with exactly the right knowledge. Veterans' reunions often featured discussions of technological innovations that had affected combat outcomes, with Kovach's cooling system modifications consistently identified as one of the most significant examples of field engineering that had directly influenced tactical results. The stories became part of World War II oral history, passed down through families and preserved in documentary projects that sought to capture the experiences of ordinary Americans who had contributed to extraordinary achievements during the war against fascism and militarism. The mathematical precision of warfare had demanded that American fighters achieve performance parity with Japanese aircraft across all operational parameters, and Kovach's cooling system modifications had addressed the specific technical limitation that prevented that parity during critical climbing flight profiles. The transformation of American tactical effectiveness following implementation of his modifications validated the principle that technological superiority required attention to seemingly minor details that could prove decisive under combat conditions. His innovation demonstrated that breakthrough performance improvements often resulted from understanding system interactions rather than advancing individual component capabilities, as the cooling modifications had optimized existing engine performance rather than requiring entirely new power plant designs. The lesson influenced post-war military procurement philosophy, emphasizing system integration and performance optimization alongside traditional requirements for individual component advancement and capability enhancement. Modern aviation historians have identified Kovach's cooling system improvements as a classic example of how practical engineering knowledge gained through hands-on experience could complement formal technical education to produce solutions that neither approach could achieve independently. The story continues to be taught in military academies and engineering schools as an illustration of how creative problem-solving and willingness to challenge existing assumptions can produce dramatic results when applied by individuals who possess both technical competence and moral courage. The broader principle that regulations must sometimes be subordinated to mission effectiveness remains a central theme in military leadership education, with Kovach's example cited as evidence that successful commanders must be prepared to assume responsibility for innovative approaches that transcend traditional policy frameworks. His achievement also demonstrated the critical importance of trust and communication between officers and enlisted personnel, as Lieutenant Commander Reed's decision to support Kovach's modifications had required confidence in the enlisted man's technical judgment and integrity. The relationship between the two men illustrated how effective military organizations must cultivate environments that encourage initiative and innovation while maintaining the discipline and structure necessary for coordinated operations under extreme stress conditions. As the decades passed and World War II veterans reached the twilight of their lives, Kovach's contribution to American victory in the Pacific gradually became recognized as one of the war's most significant examples of individual innovation affecting strategic outcomes through tactical improvements. Historical analysis revealed that his cooling system modifications had influenced the results of major fleet engagements during the final 18 months of the Pacific War, contributing to American air superiority that proved decisive during the Philippines campaign, the Okinawa invasion, and the strategic bombing of Japan itself. The technical principles he had discovered through practical experimentation became foundational elements of modern aircraft cooling system design, influencing everything from commercial aviation to military spacecraft development throughout the Cold War and beyond. Kovach died peacefully in 1978, surrounded by family members who understood his wartime service but never fully grasped the strategic significance of his technical contributions until military historians began documenting the broader implications of his innovation. His funeral in Pittsburgh was attended by former squadron mates from across the country, men who had traveled hundreds of miles to honor a mechanic whose unauthorized modifications had given them the tools they needed to survive aerial combat against one of history's most capable and determined adversaries. The ceremony included readings from letters written by pilots who credited their survival to Kovach's cooling system improvements, testimonies that transformed an ordinary funeral service into a celebration of how individual courage and innovation could influence the outcome of global conflicts when applied at critical moments with precise technical knowledge. His grave marker in Calvary Cemetery overlooked the industrial landscape where he had learned the mechanical skills that would later prove so crucial to American victory in the Pacific. A fitting memorial to a man whose practical education had enabled him to solve problems that formal engineering analysis had failed to address. The inscription simply read, "Lysander Kovach, United States Navy, Engineer and Patriot," but those words failed to capture the full significance of his achievement in transforming American tactical effectiveness during some of the most critical aerial battles of World War II. The story of Lysander Kovach illuminates a fundamental truth about warfare and innovation that transcends the specific technical details of cooling system modifications and fighter aircraft performance improvements during World War II. His achievement demonstrated that breakthrough solutions to complex problems often emerge from the intersection of practical experience, creative thinking, and moral courage, particularly when individuals are willing to accept responsibility for actions that challenge existing procedures and assumptions. The unauthorized nature of his modifications highlighted the tension between regulatory compliance and operational effectiveness that characterizes military organizations during periods of intense conflict, when traditional approaches may prove inadequate to meet unprecedented challenges. Kovich's willingness to violate Navy regulations in pursuit of solutions that would save American lives embodied the principle that true loyalty sometimes requires acting beyond orders when circumstances demand innovation that formal channels cannot provide quickly enough to affect critical outcomes. His story continues to inspire military personnel, engineers, and leaders across multiple disciplines who face similar choices between procedural compliance and mission effectiveness when confronted with problems that existing systems cannot solve adequately. The enduring relevance of his example reflects the timeless nature of the moral and technical challenges he confronted. As contemporary military forces continue to grapple with rapid technological change, evolving threat environments, and the need to optimize performance within complex organizational structures that balance innovation against safety, accountability, and coordinated operations. Modern fighter pilots flying F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightning aircraft benefit from cooling system technologies that trace their conceptual origins to the improvised modifications that one enlisted mechanic installed on the deck of an aircraft carrier during the desperate summer of 1943. When American forces were struggling to establish the technological advantages that would prove decisive in the Pacific theater. The transformation of American aerial warfare capability following implementation of Kovich's cooling system improvements demonstrated how individual innovation could cascade through entire military organizations to produce strategic advantages that affected the outcome of global conflicts, validating the principle that wars are ultimately won through the accumulated contributions of ordinary people who choose to act with extraordinary courage when circumstances demand exceptional performance. Would you have broken the regulations to save the lives of fellow Americans when official procedures proved inadequate to meet the challenges of aerial combat against a skilled and determined enemy? Comment below and share this story so others remember that sometimes the most important victories are achieved by individuals who possess the courage to act beyond their orders when action is desperately needed to protect those who depend on their expertise and dedication.